2018. Southport, Nova Scotia, is a small coastal town where life usually flows calmly, and the only news that makes it into the papers has to do with the weather, elections, or school events. But on that April day, the entire town's attention was fixed on the municipal hall. People had even gathered on the street outside, listening to the broadcast over loudspeakers. Inside, there were cameras, journalists, flashing lights. Officials stood behind a long table, on which lay folders bearing the provincial coat of arms and glasses of water. The air was tense, as if something important was about to happen. The chief of the city's police department stepped up to the podium. He looked out at the room, paused, and uttered a phrase that changed the atmosphere in an instant. 5 years ago, our town lost Leah Brown. Today, we found her. The words were spoken calmly, but there was something in them that made everyone freeze. For a few seconds, there wasn't a single sound. Even the camera flashes stopped. Then someone quietly whispered, "What?" And chaos erupted. Microphones were thrust forward, journalists interrupted one another, and someone was already calling their editor. The news seemed impossible. 5 years ago, Leah's disappearance had been a tragedy for all of Southport. She was searched for weeks. The forests, the coast, abandoned buildings, everything was combed over. The town came together, but no trace was ever found. In time, life moved on. The Brown family went to stay with relatives for a while. The volunteer headquarters closed, and the banners with her photograph faded in the sun. And suddenly, an announcement that she was alive. The police chief continued. He spoke evenly, without emotion, as if he understood just how fragile this news was. He reported that her identity had been confirmed, that Leah was under the care of specialists, and that a reunion with her parents had already taken place. There were no details. Where she was found, who reported it, what prompted the check, all of it remained unanswered. He didn't respond to the journalists' questions. The press conference ended in less than 3 minutes. Within an hour, local television channels were running special reports. The news showed archival footage from 2013, lines of cars, patrols with searchlights, people in bright vests walking in a line, illuminating the ground with flashlights, police with dogs, a helicopter with a thermal imager. On the screen was the same poster with the words "Missing Leah Brown" that had hung on every lamppost in town. On it, a bright face, a barely noticeable smile. A voiceover from the anchor said, "After 5 years of silence, a miracle has happened." Then a short clip from the police station aired. A small room, plastic chairs, gray walls, standard fluorescent lights overhead. In the center sat Mark and Susan Brown. They were side by side, not speaking. Susan could be seen nervously clenching her hands. The door opened, and a girl walked into the room, slowly, with her eyes downcast. A few seconds of silence. Then the mother stood up and took a step. The embrace was brief, but it held everything: shock, disbelief, relief. The camera captured the moment and immediately pulled back, as if giving them their privacy. There was no sound on the recording, only the rustle of a microphone. A few hours later, the family left the building. Outside, there were dozens of reporters. The flashes were blinding. Someone shouted Leah's name. Someone else tried to ask a question. Mark quickly opened the car door. Susan got in first, followed by Leah. The car pulled away. It drove off slowly, and even after it disappeared around the corner, the cameras kept filming. That evening, the news ran with headlines like, "Leah Brown has returned home," and "Southport police close one of their longest cases." Journalists spoke of a miracle, of the investigators' professionalism, of a rare case with a happy ending. In the comments, there were words of support, gratitude, and photos of candles outside the police station. The town celebrated as if someone they had long lost forever had returned. But behind all the excitement, almost no one noticed a strange detail. In the police press release sent out that same day, there was a short item that didn't make the news. In the identity verification section, there was a note: "Confirmed visually, DNA analysis results are pending." To the journalists, it looked like a formality, a standard procedure. But for those who had followed the case from the very beginning, this exact phrase would soon become an alarming signal. Because a few weeks later, when the analysis results arrived, Southport would understand. What seemed like a miracle might be the beginning of a very different story. A story where every detail from the past years would begin to take on a new, much darker meaning. 2013. Southport was a town where life rarely offered surprises. A fishing harbor, quiet streets, a supermarket by the highway, a two-story school with blue walls. A place where everyone knew each other, and unfamiliar faces were remembered instantly. This was where the Brown family lived. An ordinary house in a residential area, a white fence, a lawn, a couple of old maples by the road. On the mailbox, a sticker with their last name, faded by the sun. Leah was the family's only child. She was described as calm, a bit withdrawn, but very attentive to details. She loved to draw, mostly animals and the sea. In her room, they would later find a stack of sketchbooks, neatly signed and numbered. At school, teachers said she was never in conflicts, kept to herself, but always did everything perfectly. She had no strange acquaintances, no troubling episodes in her past. Not a single reason that could make anyone think something unusual might happen to her. Mark Brown, her father, worked as an accountant at a transportation company. A quiet, meticulous, punctual man who left the house every morning at exactly 7:40. Susan, his wife, taught at the local school. Everyone in Southport knew her. She ran a drawing club, organized exhibitions of children's drawings at the library, and often took Leah with her. They were considered a model family. No scandals, no rumors, no debts. The town was used to them as something constant. May 15, 2013 was no different from any other day. According to Weather Service reports, it was clear, with no wind, and the temperature was around 17 degrees Celsius. In the afternoon, Susan was at home, preparing her lessons and materials for the next day's class. Mark hadn't returned from work yet. Leah was playing in the yard. This was their usual routine. A neighbor's security camera showed her going outside at 3:06 p.m., carrying colored pencils and some sort of notepad. A few minutes later, Susan received a phone call. The conversation was short, a little over 10 minutes. When she went out into the yard, the play area was empty. A ball lay by the gate, the shed door was ajar. Everything looked calm, but Leah was nowhere to be seen. Within half an hour, Susan had searched the entire property, called the neighbors, and checked the backyard, the garage, and the park across the street. At 4:10 p.m., she called the police. This was recorded in the call log. The first patrol cars arrived 8 minutes later. They immediately secured the area. Canine units were called in, and local volunteers began to search the wooded area that stretched along the coast. No one saw her leave. Not passers-by, not drivers, not neighbors. The footage from the nearest cameras was empty. Not a single car, not a single unknown person. That evening, the search was expanded by several kilometers. The Coast Guard joined the effort, checking the bay and nearby buildings. The result was zero. The next day, the police set up a temporary command post at the school. The search continued around the clock. Volunteers with thermal imagers, flying drones, even private investigators. 3 days later, more than 100 people were working on the scene. They checked everything: wells, old hangars, basements, but they found nothing. No personal belongings, no footprints, no signs of a struggle. It was as if a person had simply vanished from existence. As the search entered its third week, the first doubts began to appear in the reports. Abduction, runaway, accident. But without evidence, it was impossible to build a single logical theory. The line of investigation gradually faded. A month later, the case was officially classified as unsolved. The only hope was kept alive by the parents, who continued their own search. Mark put up flyers, sent out photographs, and traveled to neighboring provinces. Susan ran online groups, wrote to journalists, and contacted organizations that help in such cases. They both lived in anticipation of a call, a letter, any lead at all. But the phone never rang. 5 years passed. By the time the police announced the miracle, no one was expecting anything anymore. Leah Brown had become a symbol of unfulfilled hope, a story remembered with a heavy sigh. And in 2018, she suddenly returned, as if from nowhere. That's why the news had the effect of an explosion. It felt as if reality itself had gone into reverse. But if you look closely at the timeline of the disappearance, everything looks too clean, too smooth. No trace, no witnesses, no explanation. And when, a few weeks later, they began to re-examine the materials of the old case, it would become clear. The strangest thing about Leah Brown's story was not even her return, but how invisibly she had managed to disappear in the first place. 3 weeks after the disappearance, a call came into the Southport police station. The voice on the other end of the line was male, hesitant, as if the person had spent a long time steeling himself to make the call. He said he had seen a girl who looked a lot like Leah Brown in the company of a man who worked on a construction site near the highway. There were almost no details, but the call was logged, and the next day, the police checked the address. This moment became the first turning point in the case. Until then, everything had been stalled. The search had yielded no results, and no witnesses had come forward. The call seemed like a faint hope, but it was what moved the investigation from a state of waiting into an active phase. The name of the man Leah was allegedly seen with was quickly established: Arthur Finch, 45 years old. Finch was known to the locals for petty offenses. He worked odd jobs, helped with equipment repairs, and did handyman work. He lived on the outskirts of town in a trailer parked at an old truck stop. In town, he was considered an oddball, reclusive, but not dangerous. In the past, he had convictions for stealing tools and attempting to sell stolen parts. He served a short sentence, then came back and lived quietly. The police knew of him, but hadn't shown any interest. When detectives arrived at the truck stop, he didn't try to hide. On the contrary, he came out to meet them. He calmly said that he hadn't seen anyone, hadn't abducted anyone, and that it was all a mistake. He looked confused, but not frightened. They questioned him on the spot, then invited him to the station. Finch agreed. During the interrogation, he repeated the same thing. He had nothing to do with the disappearance. He claimed he was at work that day, which his foreman could confirm. The investigators checked his alibi, It was partially confirmed. Finch had indeed been working on the construction site in the morning. But in the afternoon, according to him, he had left to get tools and only returned in the evening. This gap of several hours remained unclear. For the investigation, it was a window of opportunity. A day later, his trailer was searched. Inside, everything was typical: old furniture, tools, dishes, a few clothes. There was no direct evidence, no personal items belonging to Leah, no traces that could indicate her presence. But in his truck, parked nearby, forensic investigators found a tiny blue fiber. At first glance, it was an insignificant find. However, analysis showed that its structure and composition matched the material of the jacket Leah was seen in on the day of her disappearance. The match wasn't 100%, but it was close enough to be of interest. For the police, this was the first piece of physical evidence in the entire investigation. The press found out about the discovery almost immediately. A headline appeared in the news: "Suspect found." Finch's name became known throughout the province. His photo was published in the newspapers, a man with a thick beard, his gaze averted, as if avoiding the camera. His reputation as a loner, with no family or friends, only intensified the suspicion. In the public eye, everything fell into a simple narrative. Here was the strange man on the outskirts, and here was the missing girl. That was enough to start an avalanche. The investigation built a theory. It had a certain logic. Finch could have ambushed her in her yard, taken her away in his truck, and hidden the evidence. The lack of witnesses was explained by the fact that the Brown family's house was in a quiet neighborhood where few people passed by. The prosecution argued that the fiber was enough evidence to open a case. A month later, Finch was arrested. There was no direct evidence against him, but public pressure was mounting. The Brown family supported the police's decision. They believed he was guilty. For them, it was the only way to give any meaning to what had happened. The prosecution built its case around circumstantial facts: the fiber, the lack of an alibi, the suspicious biography. The case was sent to court. Arthur Finch insisted on his innocence, but no one took his words seriously. Even his lawyer told the press, "The case against my client is weak, but public opinion has already delivered its verdict." Thus, an investigation that began with a single anonymous phone call turned into a criminal case where evidence was scarce, but conviction was abundant. Finch became the primary and only suspect, and the Leah Brown case gradually ceased to be a search. It was now a prosecution. When the court delivered its verdict in December 2013, it seemed that justice had been restored. Arthur Finch received 25 years without the possibility of parole. For the Brown family, it meant the end of waiting, a chance for closure. They no longer participated in press conferences or gave interviews. The town returned to its former life. But, as time would show, it was this very decision, the arrest and conviction of Finch, that would become the starting point for a new series of mistakes that, 5 years later, would turn into a major scandal. Because when Leah returned, the investigation would have to admit they had punished the wrong man. The trial of Arthur Finch began in February 2014. By then, the investigation had been going on for almost 9 months, and public opinion was already firmly set. The newspapers wrote that the town awaits justice, and television showed footage of the truck stop where Finch lived, with captions like, "This is where Leah Brown's trail ends." There were no empty seats in the courtroom. Journalists, local residents, and even law students had come to watch the trial, which was already being called the biggest case in Nova Scotia in the last 20 years. The prosecution's case was built on two main elements. The first was the anonymous phone call in which an unknown person reported seeing Leah with Finch. The second was the analysis of the fiber found in his truck. The prosecution had no other evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no camera footage, no witnesses. Everything rested on a single coincidence, a partial one, but presented as decisive. In his opening statement, the prosecutor declared that Arthur Finch was a dangerous man hiding behind the mask of a loner. He painted a portrait for the jury of a social outcast who had nothing but anger and resentment toward the world. Every detail of his biography, his criminal record, living in a trailer, having no family, was turned into an argument against him. The entire prosecution's speech was built on emotion, not on evidence, but on a sense of threat emanating from a man who was not like the others. Finch's state-appointed lawyer tried to build a defense around the facts. He argued that the fiber could have gotten into the truck by chance. Finch often gave rides to people, construction workers, neighbors from the truck stop, even random hitchhikers. He had no reason to hide, and he hadn't tried to destroy evidence. All they found was a single piece of fabric that was a type match with the jacket. Not a match in pattern, not in dye composition, but only in general characteristics. But in the courtroom, these arguments fell on deaf ears. The public atmosphere was charged to the limit. Reporters published articles with headlines like "The Predator of Southport" and "The case is almost solved." In the courthouse corridors, people discussed not the trial's progress, but the punishment. For everyone, it was a matter of principle. The town wanted a conclusion, not the truth. When the forensic expert was called to the stand, public attention reached its peak. She was a middle-aged woman with neat glasses and a steady voice. She read the results of the analysis. The fiber found in Finch's truck had a high degree of similarity to the material of the jacket Leah Brown was wearing on the day of her disappearance. This was a phrasing that, in legal terms, proved nothing, but to the jury, it sounded convincing. In their minds, it meant one thing: a match. The prosecutor amplified the effect. He showed a photograph of the jacket and a magnified image of the fiber under a microscope. On the screen were blue threads shimmering under the lamplight. He declared, "Here is the physical proof of Leah Brown's presence in the defendant's truck." This moment became the emotional high point of the trial. Finch, sitting next to his lawyer, listened in silence. Newsreel footage shows him occasionally closing his eyes and lowering his head. His lawyer would later say in an interview that it was at that moment he knew the case was already decided. The defense's presentation was calm, no dramatic phrases, only arguments. But against the backdrop of the emotional pressure coming from the room, they made no impression. Even when the lawyer stated that the search had not found a single piece of direct evidence, the judge interrupted him, demanding he not repeat the same thing. Finch's final words before the verdict were brief: "I didn't do it, but no one believes me." These words did not make it into the press. 2 days later, the jury returned with a decision. The verdict was read in a completely silent courtroom. Guilty on all counts. The judge handed down the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Finch did not resist. He simply nodded and said quietly, "I understand." That same day, he was transferred to a medium-security correctional facility in the province of New Brunswick. A cell, 12 square meters, 1 mattress, a metal sink, bars on the window. For him, the story ended here. For the town, it was the opposite. Southport breathed a sigh of relief. The newspapers wrote, "The Leah Brown case is closed. Justice has prevailed." In the photos were Mark and Susan Brown holding each other's hands outside the courthouse. Their faces were tense but calm. They believed the truth had been found. Only one thing remained unanswered: where Leah herself had disappeared to. But by that point, everyone was satisfied with the explanation. The evidence was destroyed, the body was never found, but the criminal had been punished. 5 years passed. Finch was still in prison, and no one remembered him. Until the day the police announced, "Leah Brown has been found, alive." And then it would become clear that Finch's trial was not the end, but only the beginning of a mistake that would now have to be corrected. 5 years pass. Spring 2018. A small roadside town on the border of Iowa and Nebraska. A patrol officer stops a girl walking along the highway. No luggage, no ID, wearing a worn-out jacket and with disheveled hair. At first, the officer thinks she's just a runaway. He asks for her name. The girl falls silent, as if searching for an answer somewhere inside herself. After a few seconds, she says, "I think my name is Leah Brown." Those words change everything. The officer returns to his car and enters the name into the missing persons database. A minute later, the screen shows a match: a 5-year-old case from Southport, Nova Scotia, a girl who went missing at the age of 8. The photo is a partial match. The same eyes, the same features, but her face has changed, matured, grown thin. He calls for backup, processes her, and reports it to the central office. News of the possible discovery spreads across the state within hours. The girl is taken to the local precinct. Doctors note exhaustion, signs of dehydration, and traces of old injuries. She speaks quietly, gets confused, and sometimes gives irrelevant answers. When asked where she has been all this time, she says only, "I lived in different houses." She doesn't respond to follow-up questions. Sometimes she falls silent mid-sentence and just stares off into the distance. Investigators try to piece together a picture. She says a man took her away, that afterward there were others, people, places, rooms where it was always dark. There are no details, no names, no cities, no precise addresses. Her story resembles fragments of a dream where everything cuts off abruptly. To the police, this seems both convincing and suspicious. Too emotional, but lacking specifics. Nevertheless, for the authorities, this is an opportunity. The Leah Brown case had become a symbol of failure, an unsolved disappearance, a wrongly convicted man, sensational headlines. Now, they could put a neat end to it. Official reports are written quickly. Department leadership tells journalists that they have preliminarily confirmed the identity of the found girl. Officials have no doubts. The match in age, appearance, and accent is obvious enough. Psychologists involved in the questioning attribute her behavior to trauma. They say memory loss and confused speech are normal reactions after a long period of isolation. No one insists on repeated interrogations. The girl is sent to a medical center and scheduled for an examination. Videos from those days show her sitting in a hospital room wrapped in a blanket, her eyes constantly downcast. She says she doesn't want her picture taken. Confirming her identity requires a DNA analysis. A sample is taken from her, a simple cheek swab. The material is sent to the laboratory in Southport, the same one that once examined the fiber from Finch's truck. The police inform the press that the results will be ready in 2 weeks. While the checks are underway, journalists are already calling her the girl who came home. Photos with her face blurred are published in the news, and television shows archival footage of the 2013 search. Anchors say, a story no one believed in anymore has found a happy ending. In Southport, flowers once again appear outside the Brown family's home. People leave notes with words of support. But within the department itself, there is caution. Some officers who worked on the case before have their doubts. In their opinion, the girl's story is too generic, and her behavior sometimes seems rehearsed. However, the command decides not to delay the process. It's important for them to show results, restore the town's trust, and close an old story that has remained an open wound for too long. While the DNA samples are being sent via internal mail, preparations for Leah's return begin in Southport. A statement is prepared for the press, and a meeting is arranged for the family. No one at that time suspects that this very analysis, performed on an expedited basis, will become a key turning point in the events to follow. A test tube labeled Brown L is sent to the laboratory in early May. 10 days later, a response comes from Southport, a confirmation of kinship. And at that moment, when the police inform Mark and Susan Brown that their daughter is alive, no one even notices that the analysis is signed by a different specialist, not the one who conducted the check 5 years ago. It seems like a formality, but it is from here that the chain of errors will begin, causing the old case to return to them once more. When the sample arrives at the Southport laboratory, everything happens faster than usual. In such cases, a DNA analysis takes weeks. The sample goes through several levels of verification, is checked against archival data, and is processed through several departments. But this time, the case is given priority status. The head of the laboratory, Dr. Harold Matthews, personally takes control of everything. He explains it simply. The case is high profile, the public is waiting for a result, and we can't afford another failure. Matthews is a man with an impeccable reputation. Over 20 years in forensics, a professor at the local university, a participant in federal programs on judicial genetics. His office is adorned with certificates, awards, and letters of thanks. To journalists, he is a symbol of professionalism. So when he says he will handle the case himself, no one doubts that everything will be done perfectly. But the pace at which the process begins to move raises questions among some employees. The sample is delivered in the evening, and by the next morning, it is already registered as processed. 48 hours later, a final report appears. For the internal system, this is almost a record. Such timelines usually only occur with a direct order from above. Officially, the documents state that the acceleration was approved by the Department of Justice. On the day the conclusion arrives, it is immediately handed over to the Southport Chief of Police, Colonel Daniel Hayes. The copy of the report bears the laboratory's emblem and seal. The text is brief. The probability of kinship between the biological samples of Leah Brown and Mark and Susan Brown is 99.9%. The conclusion confirms the familial relationship. For the system, this is enough. This single document transforms an unknown girl from Iowa into the officially found Leah Brown. The prosecutor's office confirms the results. The local administration prepares a press release. That same day, the city newspaper comes out with the headline, "Leah has returned home. 5 years of waiting are over." In the video from the press conference, the police chief is smiling. Next to him are representatives from the department and the family. Leah's mother is crying. Her father stands beside her, silent. It all looks like the end of a long story where the truth has finally triumphed. No one reads the report closely. No one asks questions about the timeline, about who conducted the analysis, or why the signatures on the document are not in the usual sequence. When the case is sent to the archives, it is just a formality. The thick folder labeled "Closed, Leah Brown" is placed on a shelf next to the others. But in the archives, As is often the case, only someone accustomed to seeing details might notice something. A young clerk named Derek Larson is filing copies into the system. He doesn't participate in investigations. His job is to check page numbers and the presence of signatures. That day, he stays late after his shift and notices a small detail. The lab report is missing the signature of one of the lab technicians, the one who was supposed to confirm that the analysis was performed. Formally, this isn't an error. The document is certified with a seal and the director's signature, but the procedure has been violated. Derek notes this in pencil in the margin and, following instructions, leaves a note for the head of the archives. Under normal circumstances, this would have been overlooked. But because of the high-profile nature of the case, even such a minor slip-up looks awkward. In the morning, Derek hands the report to his immediate supervisor, Mr. Harrison. He glances at the page, frowns, and says, "All right, we'll send a request to get it all in order. I'd rather not have someone digging through these papers later." He writes a short internal memo to the laboratory, asking to clarify who exactly performed the analysis and why they didn't sign the document. This request is sent to the laboratory that same day. To everyone else, it's just a minor bureaucratic fix, a routine check of paperwork. But it is this very line, "Clarify the performer," that becomes the first thread that will soon begin to unravel the entire tangle. While the laboratory is searching for a copy of the internal log where the analyst is recorded, the Southport department is already preparing a report on the rescue of Leah Brown. Cameras, correspondence, rehearsals before going live, everything is staged as a media event. And the letter from the archives, meanwhile, sits in a general email folder marked as low priority. But a few days later, this very request will land on the desk of a new technician who has only recently started at the lab. He will open the internal log and see that a different name is indeed listed in the performers column, not the one on the report. This discrepancy, seemingly minor at first glance, will become the first official signal that something in the Leah Brown case doesn't add up. Thus, a small administrative note becomes the starting point, the very moment from which the entire carefully constructed version of the missing girl's return will begin to crumble. When the internal memo about the missing signature reaches the head of the laboratory, everything seems to proceed according to standard procedure. But within a few hours, it becomes clear this is not a typical situation. The lab director, Dr. Matthews, summons the head of the documentation department to his office, and then the clerk himself, Derek Larson. The conversation takes place behind a closed door, without witnesses, but the sound of their voices can be heard even in the hallway. At first, Matthews speaks calmly. He asks for an explanation as to why Larson even raised the issue of the signature if the document was certified with a seal. But at some point, his tone changes. It becomes sharp, almost irritated. He accuses the clerk of excessive diligence and trying to create a problem where there is none. For a simple bureaucratic error, such a reaction seems excessive. No one raises their voice over a missing signature unless that signature is hiding something more. Larson tries to defend himself. He says he was just following protocol, as stated in the manual, but Matthews cuts him off and says a phrase that will later seem particularly strange to him. Some cases are better left alone if you don't understand how the system works. After that, he personally takes the original report, says he will check everything himself, and asks Larson to no longer concern himself with the matter. When the door closes behind him, Derek is left in the office with a sense of unease. He is young, inexperienced, but not foolish. He knows how supervisors usually behave when it comes to routine matters. And he knows that this time, the reaction was unnaturally nervous, as if his small observation had touched on something that was not meant to be touched. That evening, he returns to the archives again, officially to finish a report on another case, unofficially to check if copies of the original documents remained in the system. And he sees that the report has already been removed. In its place in the digital database is an empty line with the note, "Updating." Larson realizes that if he stays silent now, the document might simply disappear. He takes out his phone, opens a backup copy from his email, where all incoming documents used to be sent, and he takes a screenshot. The photo shows everything: the date, the case number, the missing signature, the performer's name, and the laboratory's seal. From that moment on, he is no longer just a clerk, but a person with evidence capable of starting an avalanche. He doesn't know exactly what is happening, but his instincts tell him the report has been falsified. For the next few days, he lives on edge. At work, he tries not to draw attention to himself. Matthews walks past without saying hello. His colleagues pretend not to notice anything. A few times, people from Human Resources approach him, asking if everything is all right, if he would like a transfer. It feels like a subtle hint: don't interfere. He considers what to do. Going to the police is frightening. If the issue involves falsification within the lab itself, then turning to those who collaborate with it is pointless. Besides, he signed a non-disclosure agreement. Any data leak could lead to dismissal and criminal charges. That evening, he finds the website of a non-profit organization that deals with wrongful convictions. It's a small initiative of lawyers, journalists, and former investigators who work on cases where the rights of the convicted may have been violated. He writes a short email. "I have a copy of a document that may have been forged. It is related to the Leah Brown case." A reply comes 2 days later. A woman named Sarah Hill contacts him. She is a lawyer who works in the department for reviewing forensic examinations. She speaks calmly, confidently. She asks him to forward the copy of the document, promises confidentiality, and says, "If you're right, this will be important." Larson hesitates for a long time, but eventually sends the file. Afterward, for the first time in weeks, he sleeps soundly. He doesn't know that his email will soon fall into the hands of a team that has long been searching for the slightest signs of error in old cases. This transfer of the document becomes a turning point. Unbeknownst to the system, an external observer emerges, an organization that has no chain of command to answer to, no fear of losing a position. For them, a missing signature is not a minor detail, but a possible sign of manipulation of analysis results. From this moment on, the story ceases to be an internal matter of the laboratory. It goes public, and for the first time in 5 years, someone not connected to the police or the prosecutor's office gets their hands on a document that could shatter the official version of Leah Brown's return. When the lawyers from the Rehabilitation Project receive the scan of the report from the Southport lab, they initially think it's a simple case of negligence, a missing signature, a breach of protocol, perhaps just a rush job or human error. But one of the analysts, a specialist in forensic genetics, notices that the report lists an old archival sample number, one that once belonged to the materials from the Brown case. He checks this number against the Federal Registry, and he realizes that this is not a new sample, but an identifier assigned to the biomaterial taken from Leah's mother, Susan Brown, back in 2013 during the initial investigation. This is not a formatting error. It's a technical code, unique to each case. It can't be accidentally confused. If it matches, it means someone deliberately substituted the data or uploaded the old sample instead of the new one. The lawyers begin to dig deeper. The databases show that the sample from the found girl was never even registered in the official system. This means that, effectively, the analysis never took place. Gradually, the picture comes together. The report didn't compare 3 samples, mother, father, and the found girl, as it should have, but 2, the mother and the father. With such a setup, the kinship match would indeed be 99.9%, because it's essentially a test between spouses. It turns out that the entire document, which had become proof of the miracle, was not just shoddy work, but a deliberate forgery. For the lawyers at the Rehabilitation Project, this is not just an error, it's material for a case of professional misconduct. They document every detail: the time the samples arrived, the date of the report, the electronic signatures, the system login logs. And most importantly, they find that on the day the analysis was supposedly conducted, the lab's system was disconnected from the federal server for several hours. The official reason was technical maintenance. It was during this time that the new report was uploaded. The lawyers prepare a motion. In it, they demand an independent expert examination, a check on the integrity of the original samples, and an investigation into who had access to the database on the day of the test. Simultaneously, they file a petition with the court requesting a review of the results. The district attorney's office reacts instantly. At an emergency hearing, representatives of the prosecution declare that the lawyers are trying to destabilize public opinion and slander a family that has endured a tragedy. Interviews with officials appear on television, calling it a cruel PR stunt exploiting someone else's pain. To the public, it looks like an attack on the happy ending of a story the town was so proud of. A closed court hearing begins. A federal judge, having received the materials, carefully examines the evidence. He sees the copy of the report with the incorrect number, the letter about the signature discrepancy, and the data about the temporary system shutdown. This is enough to suggest that a substitution could have occurred. He demands an explanation from the lab's management and schedules a hearing with representatives from the Department of Justice. The decision is made 3 days later. The court grants the lawyer's motion. A re-examination is ordered, but this time not in Southport, but in a federal laboratory under the supervision of the FBI. The samples used in the old case are seized from the archives. Their transfer takes place under guard. Everything is documented, recorded on video. When copies of the court's decision land in the hands of the lawyers from the Rehabilitation Project, they realize that everything has now changed. What began with a single missing signature has led to an official federal investigation. For the prosecution, it's a blow. For the police, it's a disgrace. For the Brown family, it's a new ordeal. Because if the DNA analysis was faked, it means the girl currently living with them under the name Leah might not be who they thought she was at all. Short articles appear in the news about a re-verification of old case data. For now, the public is told it's an internal audit. But within the system, panic has already set in. Someone from the lab's management goes on vacation. Several employees are transferred to other departments. Officially, it's unrelated to the case. Meanwhile, federal specialists begin their review. They open the envelopes with the original samples, check the codes, and document every detail. The report is expected in 10 days. And it is this report that will become the document that not only casts doubt on the old investigation, but also exposes the chain of actions that led to the conviction of an innocent man in 2013. Now the investigation moves to a new level. A story that was considered finished is reopened, and what was long thought to be a miracle begins to look like a carefully orchestrated lie. The seizure of materials proceeds quietly, without press or announcements. Federal agents arrive in Southport early in the morning. The entrance to the laboratory is blocked, and staff are temporarily denied access to the archives. Everything is recorded on video. Before witnesses, they open the safe where the envelope labeled Brown Case 2018 was stored. Inside is a sealed container with biological material bearing the signature of the same Harold Matthews. The container is placed in an isothermal box, seals are applied, and it is transported under the escort of 2 agents to an independent laboratory in another state, one that collaborates with the FBI and specializes in judicial reviews. This is no longer an internal check or a departmental audit, but a full-fledged federal examination. Here, everything is done with mathematical precision and without any possibility of outside interference. Over the next few days, the lab staff register the material, conduct a visual inspection, and verify signatures and archival codes. In the process, they note a curious detail. The packaging had been opened and resealed, but there were no official records of this. This is the first confirmation that someone had already tampered with the material. The analysis begins. The examination takes almost a week. Each procedure is duplicated by an independent expert, and each result is entered into the system twice. Control DNA samples are taken from Mark and Susan Brown, the parents. Everything proceeds according to protocol, with no room for error. And then, on the 9th day, the laboratory sends its report. The result is shocking. No match in the genetic profile. The probability of biological kinship between the subjects is 0%. Not a single one of the markers that determine family ties matches. This means that the girl everyone called Leah Brown has no relation to the Brown family whatsoever. The report is sent directly to the federal court, with copies to the Department of Justice and the prosecutor's office. This is no longer just an error. It is evidence tampering in a criminal case. That same day, a judge signs an order to launch a federal investigation. Everything is brought under scrutiny. The Southport Laboratory, the police archives, the correspondence between the local prosecutor's office and the department, financial records, minutes of official meetings. The FBI opens a case on charges of falsification of evidence and obstruction of justice. Dr. Matthews' name is at the very center of the investigation. He is called in for questioning, but refuses to comment, citing his lawyer. Next, 2 lab employees who handled the tests in 2018 fall under suspicion. One of them suddenly resigns, while the other disappears. He is later found in a neighboring state working a temporary job under a different name. Investigators discover that during the test, these 2 employees had access to the archival samples and the internal database servers. The system's log file points to them, a record of their login and logout times. It all coincides with the period when the system was under maintenance. The FBI pieces together the scheme. Someone in the laboratory's leadership deliberately substituted the sample so that the analysis result would confirm the desired outcome. Why is not yet clear. Perhaps to cover up an old mistake. Perhaps to protect their reputation. Or maybe to prevent a review of Arthur Finch's sentence, because that would mean admitting he was convicted on false evidence. Meanwhile, information about the test results leaks to the press. First, as a short note in a regional publication, then on the evening news. The broadcast shows footage of the girl who called herself Leah walking down the street, accompanied by social workers. A headline flashes across the screen. Federal examination casts doubt on identity of found girl. For the town, it's a shock. For the Brown family, a catastrophe. And for the prosecutor's office, a threat of collapse for a decade-long case. Now, it's not just about a false identification, but about systemic corruption that has infected the investigative and forensic bodies. From this moment, the story ceases to be the tragedy of one family. It transforms into a story of how a lie, once started for the sake of peace of mind, grew into a crime on a state level. The federal investigation is just beginning, but it is already clear. The focus now is not on Leah, but on those who orchestrated her return. After the results of the independent examination were announced, the investigation entered a new phase. Federal agents returned to Southport, but now they were not interested in the story of Leah's disappearance itself, but in who exactly orchestrated the forgery that allowed the found girl to be declared rescued. They started with the laboratory, with those who had direct access to the samples and reports. The first to be called in for questioning was the junior lab technician, the one whose signature was missing from the report. At first glance, he was an insignificant figure, one of those who simply follow instructions. But he turned out to be the weak link. Initially, he remained silent, saying he knew nothing and that his supervisor had signed the document. However, when investigators showed him the internal system logs and a printout of his phone calls, his defense crumbled. He confessed that on the day the report was prepared, Dr. Matthews, the head of the laboratory, approached him and ordered him to replace the sample, citing a directive from above. According to him, Matthews spoke calmly, confidently, but made it clear that refusal was not an option. That same evening, the lab technician uploaded a different file into the system, one containing the archival data from the old Brown family test. This interrogation became a turning point. The FBI now had a specific name. The very next day, Matthews himself was called in. He arrived with his lawyer, maintaining a composed and confident demeanor, as if the whole situation were a misunderstanding. For the first few hours, he denied everything. He said he gave no such instructions, and that all decisions were made in accordance with procedure. The investigators followed a standard strategy. They presented the testimony of his subordinate, then a copy of a text message where Matthews had sent a short message: "Update the report urgently. Do it as discussed." After that, his tone changed. He stopped denying it, but claimed he had not acted on his own initiative, that he had been under pressure. When the agents asked who exactly had pressured him, Matthews paused and named a name: Detective Daniel Reed, who had led the investigation into Leah Brown's disappearance in 2013. According to Matthews, it was Reed who had personally come to the lab on the day the new sample arrived and insisted that the result be without any uncertainties. He hadn't directly demanded a forgery, but he had made it clear that there should be no doubts. Reed was called in for questioning. By this time, he was the deputy chief of the county's criminal division. In recent years, he had made a rapid ascent in his career. Promotions, awards, media interviews. He was the face of a successful investigation. When Leah was found in 2018, it was he who gave the press conference and uttered the phrase that all the local papers later quoted: Sometimes justice returns to those who never stop believing. During the interrogation, Reed maintained his composure. He stated that he had never interfered with the lab's work and that any actions by its staff were an error on their part. But the investigators already had a document indicating that he had personally overseen the review of cases related to Leah Brown's disappearance and had signed the order for collaboration with the Southport Laboratory. When the FBI began to analyze his service record, a clear picture emerged. After the successful closing of the case in 2018, Reed received a promotion, a bonus, and a transfer to the county administration. His career depended on one story, the very one where an innocent man was convicted, and years later, the missing girl was found. If it had been discovered back then that the girl was not the real one and the test results were fake, everything he had built would have collapsed in a single day. For Reed, admitting a mistake was equivalent to admitting his own guilt. His service record included the line, "solved a high-profile case." Erase that, and his entire career would become a sham. He understood all too well that any review would put an end not only to him, but also to those who had promoted him. The investigation reached a conclusion. There was a motive. The forgery allowed him to preserve his career, reputation, and status. But it remained unclear whether he was the originator of the entire scheme or was acting under someone else's orders. Because signs of higher-level intervention were appearing in the case. Documents with approvals from officials in the law enforcement department, containing phrases like "coordinated with the administration." Now the investigation widened. From one name, a whole network grew. The head of the laboratory, the investigator, the officials, all were connected by a single goal: to prevent the past from becoming the present again. And as the FBI pulled up old archives, it became clear. There was another layer to this story, one that was no longer about Leah Brown, but about the system itself, which had decided it was easier to fake the truth than to admit a mistake. After the interrogations and the leak of the first documents, Detective Daniel Reed became the central figure in the investigation. His arrest took place early in the morning. Cameras were not allowed. It was done quietly to avoid publicity. The report was brief: detained on suspicion of falsifying evidence and abuse of official position. For a man who had stood at podiums for years, given interviews, and symbolized the fight for justice, this sounded like a complete collapse. During questioning, Reed remained composed. He didn't argue or make excuses, simply stating that he acted in the interest of the case. When investigators tried to find out who gave the orders to substitute the materials, he fell silent. His phrase was repeated almost verbatim: "I didn't break the system, I protected it." This answer was unsettling. He wasn't saying, "I'm not guilty." He was saying, "I was loyal." The FBI decided to look for other ways to apply pressure. Agents obtained his financial records, bank transactions, and history of major purchases. And there, after a few hours of analysis, the first real lead appeared. The record showed the repayment of a large mortgage loan, an amount nearly equal to 3 years of his salary. The date of the transfer coincided with the period immediately following Arthur Finch's trial. The source of this money was listed as a private loan, with no name provided. A bank trace revealed that the funds came through a front company linked to a legal fund that had financed the district attorney's election campaign. Formally, it was legal. In reality, it was a scheme through which anything could be funneled. The investigators dug deeper. They checked emails, official reports, and contacts. It turned out that during that period, Reed had frequently communicated with the district attorney's assistants, the very people who coordinated interactions between the police, the laboratory, and the press. Reed was not just a detective, he was the face of the campaign. His name appeared in official press releases and even on campaign banners. The Brown case was solved thanks to the persistence of Detective Reed. Now it became clear that this was not a personal mistake, but a link in a system. When Leah disappeared in 2013, the investigation was struggling with no results, and it was then that the prosecutor's office saw an opportunity in the case. Southport was a weary town where public trust in the authorities was declining, and local elections were approaching. For District Attorney William Clayton, a high-profile case resolution was a chance to regain control of the county. All that was needed was a suspect, a motive, and evidence. Arthur Finch was a perfect fit. A loner, no family, a strange biography. A convenient figure for television. And when the case went to trial, it was Clayton who first voiced the theory of his guilt. The trial was broadcast on local TV channels, and the public followed every session. After the verdict, Clayton's approval rating nearly doubled. A few months later, he won the election under the slogan, "I brought order back to Southport." When the girl claiming to be Leah appeared in 2018, the situation became even more advantageous. Her return became proof of the system's effectiveness. The criminal was punished, the victim was saved, the family was reunited. For Clayton, it was a gift from fate. His career platform was strengthened. Now he hadn't just won in the past, he had restored justice. It was then that Reed was once again in the spotlight. He was nominated for a county-level promotion. He received an award for meritorious service. His name was mentioned in federal reports. Everything seemed perfect, until the story with the DNA came to light. Now the investigation had the full picture. After the test results threatened to cast doubt on the old case, Reed didn't just cover up the forgery, he orchestrated it. And Matthews, the head of the laboratory, was merely the executor. In return, Reed received support from above, partially forgiven debts, a promotion, and a guarantee that his career would remain untouched. The FBI formulated its conclusion. Reed acted in the interests of the prosecutor's office. The forgery protected not him personally, but the political system built upon this case. He became part of a scheme in which every player knew their role. One substituted the analysis, another turned a blind eye, and a third declared it a victory. While the detective sat in custody, the agents moved on to the next level, to District Attorney Clayton. His name was already appearing in financial records, and now the investigation transformed from a story about a crime into a story about power, where the truth was more expensive than any lie. On the appointed day, District Attorney William Clayton was brought to the FBI's Washington field office. He did not arrive in handcuffs, but under escort. Outside, dozens of journalists had been waiting since morning. Clayton walked straight, his back erect, his gaze cold. No confusion, no fear, only the confidence of a man who had been in power for too long to believe that power could end. In the room were two investigators. One took notes, the other asked questions. Clayton sat down, placed his hands on the table, and made a short remark. "It took you long enough to get to this. I hope you have something more than rumors." He knew every word was being recorded and immediately established his line of defense. Everything, he said, was a political attack. An attempt to tarnish the reputation of a man who had achieved real results. The investigators listened calmly. They didn't interrupt. They let him speak. He listed his accomplishments, his victories, his high-profile cases. It all sounded like a press release, but with each sentence, a tension grew in his voice. He spoke of justice, but avoided mentioning any names, not Finch, not Reed, not Matthews. The first half hour of the interrogation was fruitless. Clayton denied everything. Any accusations of pressuring the investigation were nonsense, according to him. He insisted that the prosecutor's office does not interfere with forensics tests and does not give direct orders to the police. The investigators recorded his testimony and moved on to the next phase. They brought out documents, not photos, not recordings, but originals. The first was a transcript of the lab director's testimony. The second was Detective Reed's confession. Both documents were certified, each bearing signatures. An investigator read a passage where Reed stated directly, "The decision on the re-examination was not made by me. The order came from the district attorney's office." Clayton listened and smiled. He said he had no intention of commenting on phrases taken out of context, that any subordinate under pressure from an investigation would say anything. His face was calm, but small gestures revealed his discomfort. He took a glass of water, took a sip, and for the first time avoided eye contact. The investigators didn't press him. They gave him time. Then they placed a new document on the table, an internal memo written by Detective Reed back in 2013. The page contained a brief report. Insufficient evidence in the Brown case to bring charges. Recommend extending the investigation period. Below it was a handwritten resolution. Continue development. Need a result by the end of the month. The signature read, W. Clayton. The room grew quiet. Clayton took the sheet, stared at it for a long time. He refused to acknowledge the signature, then demanded a graphology expert examine it. But one of the investigators calmly replied that the examination had already been conducted, and it confirmed its authenticity. At that moment, Clayton's confidence began to fade. He realized the interrogation was no longer about opinions, but about facts. The investigator asked a direct question. Did he know that the investigation had no direct evidence against Arthur Finch? Clayton didn't answer. Then he said, "We were acting within the law. We needed to show a result." These words sounded like a confession, though formally they were not. The investigators continued their line of questioning. It was important for them to show not only the fact of pressure, but also the motive. They reminded him of his election campaign, the banners, the speech where he promised to put an end to crime once and for all. All of this coincided in time with the period when the Brown case was becoming the central topic in the news. When they presented him with financial documents showing that some of his fund's money came from companies that later received government contracts, Clayton lost his composure. He raised his voice, saying he was not obligated to explain his accounting. But the investigators didn't argue. They simply added, "These same companies paid for witnesses' travel and press conferences for the Brown case. We have proof of the transfers." After that, he fell silent. A few seconds of silence. Then, a short phrase. "I want to speak with my lawyer." The interrogation ended there. The investigators noted the time, 4:42 p.m. The report stated, "The accused refused to give further testimony until consulting with counsel." That was enough. The FBI now had everything: a chain of command, financial trails, and documents confirming pressure on the investigation and the laboratory. A day later, the state prosecutor's office officially suspended Clayton from his position. The process of preparing an indictment began. The investigation escalated to the federal level, And now, several officials who had participated in the 2013 campaign became subjects of the case. What had once begun as a private tragedy was turning into the region's largest corruption scandal. And for the first time in many years, the old case was reopened in the Southport archives, the case where it all began. Because along with the exposure of the forgery, the main question returned. If the found girl wasn't Leah, then where was the real one? When the federal investigation concluded, the lawyers from the Rehabilitation Project did what they had set out to do from the beginning. They filed an appeal against the conviction of Arthur Finch, the man whose life had been destroyed by forgery and systemic failure. The petition stated, "New circumstances in the case prove that the conviction was based on falsified evidence and a violation of procedural norms." By this point, they had everything that had once seemed impossible to obtain. The independent DNA test showed that the found Leah had no connection to the Brown family. Sworn confessions were given by the lab employees and the investigator who participated in the substitution of results. And finally, the internal memo from District Attorney Clayton, the document that became a symbol of pressure from above. But the lawyers made one more move. They returned to the very first piece of physical evidence that started the whole case, the blue fiber found in Finch's truck. It was this fiber that had once sealed his fate. 10 years ago, it was declared unique and matching the missing Leah's jacket. The court took this as direct proof. Now, times were different. Analysis methods were more precise, and the experts were more independent. The new laboratory report took weeks to prepare. Every sample was examined at a microscopic level, using spectral analysis to determine the exact composition and origin of the material. When the results finally came in, they had the effect of a bombshell. The report did indeed state, "The chemical composition of the fiber matches the fabric sample from Leah Brown's jacket." The match was 100%, and for a moment, silence fell over the courtroom. It seemed as if everything was coming full circle, as if all this struggle had been for nothing, and the system had been right after all. But then came the second paragraph. It turned everything upside down. This type of fiber is an industrial-grade acrylic canvas, widely used in the production of clothing, furniture, and automotive interiors. As of 2013, this material was used in over 700 brands and product models. In other words, this fiber could have come from anywhere. The seat of a bus, the lining of a cheap jacket, the fabric of a car seat cover. The match didn't rule out coincidence. On the contrary, it made it almost inevitable. What had once been presented as a unique match was, in fact, a simple error of interpretation. The lawyers explained it to the court simply. The prosecution had built the entire logic of its case on a single piece of circumstantial evidence with no probative value. Everything else was rumors, assumptions, and emotional speculation. There was no direct evidence, no eyewitnesses, not a single credible confirmation that Arthur Finch had anything to do with Leah's disappearance. The appellate court reviewed the materials at length. The hearings lasted several days. Experts, former investigators, and representatives from the laboratories testified. Each of them confirmed the same thing. The case was conducted with violations, the expert examinations with forgery, and the trial itself under pressure from the prosecution. The decision was announced at the end of the day. The court found that the guilty verdict was based on unreliable evidence and overturned it. Arthur Finch was officially exonerated. After more than a decade in prison, his name was cleared. When his lawyer came out to the press, there was a clamor of noise, camera flashes and microphones. He uttered only one sentence: "We have proven that the truth is not what is convenient for those in power, but what stands the test of time." And at that moment, it seemed as if the story was over. But everyone who had followed this case knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Because now that the system had admitted its mistake, only one question remained, one that could not be silenced by any excuses. If Leah had been an imposter all this time, then where was the real one? When the noise surrounding the Finch case began to die down, and the bold headlines faded from the front pages, investigators returned to the person who had sparked the second chapter of this story, the girl whom the entire town had once believed to be the returned Leah Brown. Now that the DNA test had removed all doubt, she was no longer the victim in a high-profile case, but a person with no past and no name. At the police station, she was no longer met as a news hero, but an unknown who had deceived the system. She sat across from a detective, wrapped in a gray sweater they had given her upon her detention. Her hands were folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. At first glance, she seemed calm, but it was the kind of feigned indifference that hides exhaustion. Not defiant, not brazen, more like someone who had been cornered. When the detective began the interrogation, she was silent for a long time. The quiet clicking of the recorder could be heard, and the sound seemed to rally her. Her voice was barely audible, but every word was measured. She said her name was Samantha, last name Ross, and she was from Ohio. She had left home over a year ago because there was no point in staying there. She lived wherever she could, with acquaintances, at train stations, sometimes with strangers who offered shelter in exchange for small chores. One day, while passing a supermarket, she saw a notice on a bulletin board, an old poster for the missing Leah Brown. The photo was worn, but the eyes were the same, light, a little wary, similar to her own. And in that moment, as she later confessed, something just clicked inside her. She felt it was a chance, that by taking this name, she could finally become someone who was wanted. From then on, everything moved too fast. When she was detained in a neighboring state, she didn't know what to do, and said the first thing that came to mind: "My name is Leah." The system did the rest. No one doubted, no one checked. Everyone wanted to believe in the miracle so badly that they replaced reality with hope. During the interrogation, she was asked direct questions. Did she know her DNA had been substituted? Did she know her story was being used for political gain? She looked straight ahead, without averting her gaze, and answered quietly, "No." She thought it was simple. She had been mistaken for someone else. She thought everything would gradually be explained, that the experts would figure it out, and she would start a new life in a family, with a home, warmth, and some kind of care. She didn't know a spectacle was being constructed around her, where every step was calculated in advance. The investigators understood. In this story, she was not the criminal. She was a link through which too many other people's interests had passed. The laboratory, the police, the prosecutor's office, they all used her as convenient proof to close an old case and keep their jobs. She had become an instrument, not an initiator. When the case was reviewed, the prosecution declined to press charges against her. Her actions had caused no material harm to anyone, and her motive was not profit, but a desperate attempt to find her place in the world. The judge signed an order. The girl was to be provided with psychological help and temporary custody until her family circumstances could be clarified. A few days later, social services confirmed Samantha Ross's identity, A missing person report had indeed been filed for her. Her mother came to the station, a tired woman, not crying, just standing at the door, unable to believe she was seeing her daughter alive. Their reunion was short, awkward, but there was more sincerity in it than in all the press conferences ever given by the officials. Samantha was placed in care, and psychologists and specialists worked with her. The press no longer wrote about her. The story lost its sensationalism, and for most viewers, she became a footnote, an epilogue. But for those who had followed the case, it was clear. There was no malice in her confession, no deception for personal gain. There was only loneliness, which had become the catalyst for a massive lie. Her fate became the final note in this long investigation, closing the chain of events. And yet, behind this quiet ending, a resonance remained, because with the closing of one case, another was reopened, the real, unsolved disappearance of Leah Brown, which had started this whole story. After all the confessions and collected documents, investigators began to reconstruct the timeline of events, step by step, as if assembling a scattered mosaic. It was now clear. The crime they were investigating was not an abduction or a disappearance, but a deliberate forgery committed by people in positions of power. Spring 2018. A report about a detained girl with no documents arrives at the small police station in Southport. A patrol officer, following procedure, enters her name into the missing persons database, and suddenly a match appears. Her appearance, age, even a rare scar on her arm, all match the description of Leah Brown, who had been considered missing for 5 years. A few hours later, the information is on the desks of District Attorney Clayton and lead detective Morgan. To an outsider, this would have looked like joyful news, but in the offices of the District Attorney, it caused panic. Because if this girl was truly Leah, then everything their careers were built on, Finch's arrest, the high-profile conviction, the election victory, would turn into a house of cards. Any doubt about Finch's proven guilt would jeopardize the entire system. According to witness testimony, the conversation between the prosecutor and the detective took place that same evening, behind closed doors. The message was brief. "We can't let this story be turned upside down. Make sure it's her." This phrase would later become a key piece of evidence in the case file. It left no room for interpretation. From there, everything unfolded rapidly. Detective Morgan met with the head of the forensic lab, Thomas Lang, a man with an impeccable reputation and a quiet demeanor. He disliked conflict and understood that defying an order from the prosecutor's office was dangerous. He was told directly, "You need to confirm the kinship between the girl and the Brown family. No questions, no delays. They're waiting for the report upstairs," was the phrasing. Lang summoned a junior lab technician, the same one whose signature would later disappear from the final document. The order was short. Substitute one of the DNA samples in the analysis. No explanations. Just do it. And he did. The result was a report with a nearly 100% match. Lang's signature was on the last page, and the document was sent up the chain. The prosecutor personally reviewed the report before it went to the press. The paper with the official seal became not just evidence, but a symbol of Leah's resurrection. This paper was shown to her parents, leaving them no room to doubt for a second. And to explain away any discrepancies in the girl's appearance and behavior, an official explanation was introduced: post-traumatic amnesia, a powerful term that could hide any inconsistencies, forgotten habits, unfamiliar mannerisms, even the failure to recognize loved ones. Leah's mother cried and hugged her found daughter. Her father was silent, but his gaze was troubled. He would later admit that even then he felt something was wrong. But the prosecutor, journalists, and police officers were standing right there. Too many official figures to allow himself to doubt. Meanwhile, the media received a press release drafted by the Public Relations Department. It contained precise wording chosen with surgical care. A miraculous return. A story that inspires hope. The news outlets picked it up instantly. Cameras, interviews, glowing articles. And the town of Southport once again became a symbol of justice prevailing after years. Under the cover of this noise, the system breathed a sigh of relief. All the participants in the conspiracy acted as if nothing unusual had happened. The documents were filed, the reports were submitted, the prosecutor received another promotion, and the detective got a bonus. Each of them reassured themselves with the thought that it was all for the greater good, that no one would be harmed by this lie. But the truth, as it turned out, was merely postponed. The substitution didn't just save some people's jobs, it completely erased the line between an investigation and a performance. And now, as investigators reconstructed this scenario, it became obvious. The lie had been constructed so masterfully that even those who created it had started to believe it. This reconstruction revealed the final facet of the story. The Leah Brown case was no longer just a judicial error. It had become a mirror, reflecting the entire system, from the honest executors to those who skillfully directed others' hands. And this discovery became the bridge to the next stage, investigating what really happened to the real Leah. When the investigation completed its work, the moment that everything had been leading to for months finally arrived: the trial. The vast courtroom of the Federal District Court was filled with journalists, human rights advocates, former colleagues of the defendants, and ordinary people who had come to see the system judge itself. In the dock were three men: former District Attorney George Clayton, Detective Morgan, and Lab Director Thomas Lang. Each had once been considered a model of public service. Now, all three were charged with falsifying evidence, obstructing justice, and abusing their official positions. The trial dragged on for several weeks. Prosecutors from another district, brought in specifically to ensure neutrality, laid out the chain of documents, emails, and testimonies step by step. The defense lawyers fought to the end, trying to portray everything as administrative errors or a misunderstanding. But their main adversary was something they couldn't sweep under bureaucratic carpets: ambition and the fear of exposure. The climax of the trial came when the jury was read Detective Morgan's internal memo, the one where he expressed doubts about Finch's guilt, bearing Clayton's handwritten resolution: need a result by the end of the month. The courtroom fell silent. The judge paused, looked over the document, and said quietly, "That's enough." After that, the trial was no longer about finding the truth, but about calculating sentences. The verdict was unanimous. All three were found guilty on all counts. The lab director received a 7-year sentence, the detective 9, but the heaviest blow fell on Clayton. He was given 15 years in prison without the possibility of parole. For a man who had built his career on fighting crime, this sentence sounded like symbolic retribution. The system was now judging its own architect. As the decision was announced in the courtroom, journalists captured every emotion. Lang lowered his head, his hands trembling. He looked lost. The detective sat motionless, as if he had already lived through all of this long before the verdict. And Clayton, the very man who once commanded a room with a single glance, smiled. A brief, strange smile, as if he couldn't believe it was really over. That same day, The court signed an order for the release of Arthur Finch. After 6 years behind bars, he walked out of the prison gates to the flash of cameras and the rustle of the autumn wind. He didn't say a word, only stopping before the journalists, looking directly into a lens and saying quietly, "Now, I just want some quiet." It was his only sentence that would later appear in all the reports. A week later, the state officially apologized to him for the judicial error. Finch received compensation, several $1 million. But no one doubted that no amount of money could bring back the years that were taken from him. He left town, avoided interviews, and never appeared on television. In official documents, he was listed as rehabilitated, but people who knew him personally said he remained a man living as if half a step removed from the present. In parallel, the court issued its final ruling on the conspirators. In the sentencing rationale, the judge wrote, "This case is an example of a systemic conspiracy that has undermined public trust in the law. Each of the participants understood what they were doing and knowingly acted for personal gain." This sentence became the headline for every newspaper. When the cameras left the courtroom and the correspondents rushed to file their reports, a sense remained that justice had finally been served, but belatedly, with a bitter aftertaste. The court had closed the book on the conspiracy, but not on the case itself. Because one detail still hung in the air: the real Leah Brown had never been found. And it was from this point that the investigation decided to return to where it all began. After the trials had concluded and the cameras had departed, old folders marked Leah Brown case were once again retrieved from the archives. After all the revelations, this was no longer just an investigation into a missing person. It had become a symbol. Now, every piece of evidence, every recording, every line of questioning was examined from a new perspective. The FBI officially reopened the case. In the reports, it sounded dry. Investigation reopened due to newly discovered circumstances, but in essence, it meant one thing: they had to start from scratch. Old expert analyses were reviewed, witnesses were sought out again, and those who had lived near the Brown family at the time were re-interviewed. But several months passed, and it became clear: the trail had gone cold. In 5 years, almost all the leads had vanished. People who might have seen something had long since moved away or forgotten the details. The areas where the searches had been conducted were now covered with new houses, and electronic data from that time was hopelessly lost. A new phrase appeared in the reports: "No new evidence capable of advancing the investigation has been discovered." This didn't mean the case was closed. On the contrary, it remained open, but in a state of suspension. It was kept alive only by those who could not give up. First and foremost, Leah's mother. She still lived in the same house where it all began, and every morning she placed a cup of tea on the windowsill, just in case she comes back. While the family lived in waiting, the system also changed. The forgery story caused a public outcry. Following this case, several states in the U.S. revised their procedures for storing and transferring evidence. Now, no DNA sample can be analyzed without the involvement of 2 independent specialists. A new verification protocol was introduced to prevent substitution. Law schools added a separate class where the Arthur Finch case is studied as an example of a judicial catastrophe born not from an accidental mistake, but from a deliberate distortion of the truth. Journalists continued to write about the aftermath of this story for a long time. Documentaries, books, and even lectures appeared about how a single decision, the order to make sure it's her, became the trigger for a whole chain of judicial crimes. For some, it became a cautionary tale. For others, proof that the truth, no matter how late it arrives, still finds its way. As for Arthur Finch, his trail was lost almost immediately after the trial. He didn't return to Southport, never gave an interview. He was seen in various places, in Colorado, then in Maine, where he reportedly lives in an old house by a lake, quietly, without visitors, without news. People who manage to speak with him say he holds no grudges. He simply doesn't want to be a part of that story anymore. He lives as if erasing his past, step by step. And the Brown family remained in waiting. The mother, as before, attended meetings with the police, brought photographs, reread old letters. The father was withdrawn, barely spoke, but his expression showed that hope had not yet died. For them, this case was not about conspiracies or corruption. It was about a missing person, without whom their house was no longer a home. In 2025, in an FBI report on unsolved cases, Leah Brown's name is still listed among active investigations. There are no new witnesses, no leads, no matches in the databases. Only an old photograph where she smiles at the camera, and the caption, "Search continues." And so this story ends, without a final resolution. The judicial system was cleansed, the guilty were punished. Arthur regained his freedom, but the truth for which it all began remained somewhere in the dark. Perhaps it has long been known, lying in a folder locked away in some archive. Or perhaps it simply doesn't exist. Today, the Leah Brown case is not just an unsolved mystery. It is a reminder that even when the system admits its mistake, human pain does not end the moment a judge bangs the gavel. Stories like this have no real ending. They simply fade into silence, leaving an echo behind.